This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Thousands of Afghans who work for the United States and other foreign countries remain stranded in Kabul 2 days after the Taliban seized control of Afghanistan. Military flights out of the Kabul International Airport have resumed a day after thousands of Afghans raced to the airport with hopes of leaving the country. They filled the tarmac, and some even tried to grab onto departing planes. At least 7 people died, including several who fell to their deaths after trying to cling onto U.S. planes as they flew out. U.S. troops also shot at least 2 people dead at the airport. On Monday, President Biden defended his decision to withdraw troops from Afghanistan.
I stand squarely behind my decision. After 20 years, I've learned the hard way that there was never a good time to withdraw U.S. forces. That's why we're still there. We were clear-eyed about the risks. We planned for every contingency, but I always promised the American people that I will be straight with you. The truth is, this did unfold more quickly than we had anticipated. So what's happened? Afghanistan political leaders gave up and fled the country. The Afghan military collapsed, sometime without trying to fight. If anything, the developments of the past week reinforced that ending U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan now was the right decision. American troops cannot and should not be fighting in a war and dying in a war that Afghan forces are not willing to fight for themselves.
On Monday, the Biden administration pledged to spend $500 million to help refugees and others trying to flee Afghanistan. But Biden is facing growing pressure to do more to help Afghan civilians. On Monday, Congressmember Ilhan Omar tweeted, "There will be plenty of time for confronting the repeated failures of Afghanistan policy over the course of 4 presidencies. The urgency of the moment now demands we marshal an international coalition to evacuate every Afghan citizen who's fleeing for their lives." Nobel Peace Prize winner Malala Yousafzai urged all countries to help Afghan refugees.
I think every country has a role and responsibility right now. Countries need to open their borders to Afghan refugees, to the displaced people. And I have sent a letter to Prime Minister Imran Khan asking him to allow refugees, but also ensure that the refugee children and girls have access to education, have access to safety and protection, that their futures are not lost, that they can enroll into local schools, they can receive education within those refugee camps. I have not yet made contact with Prime Minister Boris Johnson, but whoever can hear me right now, I think it's important for them to remember that they have such an important strategic leadership role to play right now, and they must take a bold stance for the protection of human rights right now.
Malala Yousafzai won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2014. After being shot in the face by the Taliban in Pakistan when she was 14 years old for advocating education for women and girls. Since seizing Afghanistan, the Taliban has sought to present a more moderate face to the world. Earlier today, they announced an amnesty to all government officials and urged them to return to work. The Taliban also encouraged women to join its government. And today, a female journalist from the news outlet Tolo News conducted a televised interview with a Taliban official. We begin today's show with Haroun Rahimi, assistant professor of law at the American University of Afghanistan. He was en route back to Kabul when the Taliban seized power, so he's joining us now from Istanbul, Turkey. Professor Rahimi, welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us.
Thanks to be here. Thank you.
So can you respond to all that has taken place? The extremely fast seizing of the provincial capitals and then taking Kabul without hardly a bullet. Can you talk about the significance of the Taliban victory, who they are, and what you expect?
Obviously, there's a lot to unpack there. In terms of the general fact that the Taliban took over Afghanistan, it's important to have context here. The Taliban have been growing in strength, and the government was losing ground for a very long time. It did not start matters of months. And underlying those trends were a series of political problems that were sustaining the insurgency and weakening the government legitimacy, and many other aspects of governance were suffering. But were also a military component to it. There were technical, logistical, and military issues and bad leadership that affected contributed to the overall trend, and towards the end, they exacerbated even further and resulted in the quick collapse of Afghanistan into the Taliban hand. There was also a psychological component to all of this. The way that the Taliban were received by the United States, other countries, the way they were conducting their propaganda underground, they all played a role in the matter. And we just have to go. I mean, it's going to take years to unpack what happened and how it happened, but it's a very complex picture. And just commenting on what President Biden said, I would just like to point out, because you were just playing his clip, just a few points before I go talk who the Taliban are and what it means now, where we are right now. First of all, I think the decision to withdraw troops is a decision made by the U.S. president. I will not comment on that. But just there was some inaccuracy in what he said. First of all, the fact that Afghan soldiers were not willing to die for Afghanistan. Just don't have to take my word for it. Go look at the UNAMA, the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan. They report the casualty reports of war. For a very long time, the U.S. had almost no casualty in Afghanistan, whereas there were thousands of soldiers dying every day fighting for the Republic, for the government side. So the idea that soldiers were not willing to fight is not just true. The soldiers did surrender en masse, especially towards the end. It was a complex dynamic. You can go into it. There was some political decisions made to keep soldier outposts that could not be supported, and Taliban isolated those posts and were able to pressure the soldiers to surrender, and that kind of caused a momentum that other soldiers were looking at their fellow soldiers surrendering en masse, and they got demoralized, and often they were feeling that they should not be actually fighting that hard and just may surrender, because they were afraid that if they fight hard, they would also not be supported and they would be isolated, and the Taliban always also proved very brutal when they actually ran over a post. So just that aspect of it, that the fact that Afghan soldiers were not willing to fight for the government, is just inaccurate. Just you can look at the UNAMA data and see how many soldiers were dying every day until the very end. And compared to the American troops, which towards the end, U.S., that's a good thing. U.S. had no casualty in Afghanistan, almost no casualty in Afghanistan. The other issue from his speech was that he was not willing to accept any responsibility. It was as if the U.S. was there, just bystander. The soldiers were there, and for some reason, the Afghans were in charge of everything, and they failed, and now U.S. had to leave. It's just a very disingenuous statement. The U.S. and Afghans, and the Afghan leaders he mentioned, and who are to blame they absolutely must be blamed for what happened. They both contributed to what happened in Afghanistan. Many aspects of governance, important policy decisions, conduct of war, all sort of governance issues were either Americans advised on, there were American staff involved, there was an army of consultants and NGOs, development service providers, and such that were involved in all aspects of governance, from health to education to finance, any aspects you can imagine. Similarly with the military, work closely together. I do admit, and I absolutely believe, that the responsibility to protect Afghanistan ultimately was on the Afghan government and Afghans. But whatever the outcome was, in terms of failed leadership and corrupt government, which were all true, the U.S. had a role to play. It doesn't mean that the U.S. should have stayed in Afghanistan longer. That's not what I mean. But I'm just saying that the way that President Biden was distancing U.S. from everything that happened over the past 2 years is just disingenuous and just inaccurate. And finally, with regard to the withdrawal, As I said, I'm not going to comment on whether it was a right or wrong thing, but I do believe it was not handled well. It was handled in a way that created a logistical gap in Afghan security forces. It was handled in a way that demoralized Afghan forces and created a kind of negative psychological environment for them. It was handled in a way, U.S. in rush to actually get out its troops, forced the Afghan government to make many concessions to the Taliban without getting much in return. For example, 5,000 Taliban troops were released under immense pressure from the United States. So, I mean, we can talk about how it was handled. And towards the end, the way the evacuation was handled and such, it was just horrible. Now, to your question of who the Taliban are, and it is a complex movement. It has its history. It has been morphing into different things at different times. What you can say is that it has been an effective insurgency, and they were able to cause the Afghan government to collapse. That's certain. That it is something we've witnessed. It's really not debatable. In terms of why and how they did it and what they want to do, that's a murky picture. They had a narrative they presented to their fighters to recruit and motivate them to fight that involved establishment of the Sharia, their understanding of Islamic law, which is not shared by most Afghans. Is shared by some Afghans, but not most. They also talked about getting the foreigners, whom they considered occupiers and invaders, out of the country. Those were kind of the motives that they presented for the soldiers. But also on the ground, it was a very complex picture. People joined the Taliban for different reasons, sometimes often for local dynamics, for protection, for also just taking advantage of the opportunity that would be given to someone who was part of the Taliban in terms of power and other aspects that come from being a militia that has support on the ground. There's a complex picture. They're obviously ideologically motivated actors underground as well. In terms of what they're going to be when they actually come into power, we have one reference point. When they were in power, that's in 1990s, they ruled brutally, and there are obviously, more world is familiar with it, and Afghans have experienced it firsthand, how they ruled. That's one reference point. The question is, have they changed? Will they govern differently? You pointed out that there have been different messaging. They have announced national amnesty. They have said that they, in principle, believe that women can continue education and work on their certain conditions that are not clarified yet. They have done some positive gestures so far. For example, as you pointed out, a Taliban representative talked to a woman presenter. That's a welcome development. They also allowed the Shias of Afghanistan, which are a minority, and they don't follow the dominant sect of Islam that is in Afghanistan. It's a Hanafi. They are a minority, a sizable minority in Afghanistan. Shias. They allowed them to continue the rituals of Ashura, which is an important ritual for the Shias. Involves a lot of public acts of self-plugging and other aspects. It happens every year in Afghanistan. That the Taliban allowed it. There were pictures coming up that they went actually to some of those events and they showed solidarity. That's a very positive thing. They also met with the Hindus and Sikhs representative of Afghanistan, some Taliban did, and they give them assurance that they will be protected, they will be safe in Kabul. Both of these happen in Kabul and in Herat, where I also have family members in Herat, and I talked to them, and I also have seen reports of that happening in Herat. I cannot talk to the entire country. So those are good, positive messaging. But also, on the other hand, we have reports of people being taken for questioning, people being killed because of their government connections, and reports of summary executions of the forces that were surrendered until very recently. And it's just a very mixed picture, very unclear picture at this point. And the uncertainty is fueling the refugee exodus. People are afraid of the future. They are afraid of what may come, and they're trying to get out as they can. When they can. And you have to remember, Taliban control almost entire land crossing, and there's no flight flying out of any parts of the country except for Kabul Airport, which is not under Taliban control. It is under U.S. control. So people trying to get out, they see this as a window that if it closes, U.S. leaves, then the Taliban will take over airport, and then anyone would like to leave the country, they would have to go through the U.S. through the Taliban authority. So if you are afraid of a retaliation, revenge taken by the Taliban, you will certainly try to get out as soon as possible through the Kabul airport, the only kind of party point left, without having to go through the Taliban kind of possible screening of who can leave the country. Taliban have said they will let anyone who wants to leave, but you have to realize that these messages are not very credible for very good reasons. They're not credible because until very recently, in matters of like days ago, Taliban considered any civilian judiciary employee of the government a legitimate target. And they had a complex attack not long ago, like a couple of weeks ago in Kabul, that targeted the Minister of Defense's home, guest house, which were MPs, where MPs, Afghan members of parliament, were located, and killed many civilians. It was a complex attack, a car bomb. These buildings were destroyed to a large radius of the place. And they also had an ongoing assassination kind of campaign of judiciary persecutors, of female police officers. So it was for them to claim that they have transformed in their character in this short period of time doesn't seem believable to most Afghans, and that's why you're seeing the kind of the rush to the door. And you have to realize that many people believe that it's a war tactic. As soon as Taliban consolidates power, as soon as the U.S. U.S. leaves Afghanistan, international community will not be engaged as it is right now. Then there will be kind of basically purging happening. That's why people are so afraid. Whether that's going to actually come true, or the Taliban will just come true with the messages of hopes they are giving people, just remains to be seen. But the picture is murky, and it is a mixed picture. Another complication we have here is that there is not a lot of journalism outside of Kabul happening. I mean, there has been a chilling effect on journalists not daring to go out and document what was happening. Because you have to realize Taliban have this brutal image in Afghanistan for good reasons. They have fought a brutal insurgency. They killed aid workers. They beheaded their opponents. They executed many people upon surrender. They mined many people. It was a brutal insurgency. Not to say that the government did not cause destruction. The government, through its air bombardments, destroyed many parts of the countryside, and they caused many civilian casualties. And for many of those people, the moments of rest that they're experiencing, because there's really no war going on, Taliban just took over the country, the moments of rest they're feeling is very much welcome. And they have a different feeling towards the Taliban victory. If for nothing else, just the end of war is celebrated to large parts of the country. And some of them actually hold the government accountable for the horror they were living. So I'm not trying to say just that the Taliban were the cause of all the destruction that was going on in the country. It was a war, but Taliban were using brutal methods. So now, whether it is continuing to happen in areas we don't have eyes on, because the journalists are too afraid to speak out, to document and reflect, kind of leaves us relying on a hearsay. People saying, "I heard this person say this thing happened there." Unless we have enough journalists on the ground and journalists who can actually work independently, we will not really know the full picture yet. The other side of it is that the Taliban will have to actually make pronouncement on matters of policy and then follow through. So far, they've remained vague as well.
Professor Rahimi, we have to wrap, and we have 10 seconds, but are you afraid to go back right now? You were en route when the Taliban took Kabul.
At the moment, yes. I'm still hesitant. I'm afraid of the future for my country and for everyone is there. I will go back if the promise of amnesty holds up. I do want to continue to educate the new generation of Afghanistan. They have taken over our university, American University of Afghanistan. The campus was taken over by Taliban. We had evacuated already, but they entered the campus. They controlled the campus. Whether we will be able to resume and under what conditions, what will be the rules for our operation, it's not known. We will continue to teach remotely to our students. But I would, if the promise of amnesty hold up, there is this environment where I feel like I can.
The Skype froze, but I want to thank Haroun Rahimi, Assistant Professor of Law at the American University of Afghanistan. He was speaking to us from Istanbul, Turkey. Coming up, we go to investigative journalist Asmat Khan and retired U.S. Army Colonel Ann Wright, who helped reopen the U.S. Embassy in Kabul nearly 2 decades ago. Stay with us.